The chains were not iron. That was the first thing Cassandra Briar noticed when she stumbled through the hidden door beneath the Valemont estate. The chains binding the man to the stone pillar were something older. Something that hummed with a frequency she felt in the back of her teeth, a vibration that made her vision swim, and her knees want to buckle. They were silver black and etched with symbols she did not recognize. Symbols that pulsed faintly like a second heartbeat, and they wrapped around the figure's wrists, his throat, his chest, crossing his body in a brutal geometric pattern that seemed designed not merely to restrain, but to diminish. The man they held was extraordinary, even in the dim light of the underground chamber, even bound and kneeling on cold stone with his white hair hanging loose around his face. He was the most commanding presence Cassandra had ever encountered. His skin was the precise white of fresh snow, luminous in the darkness, and the lines of his face were severe and beautiful in equal measure. High cheekbones, a sharp jaw, a mouth that looked like it had been sculpted by someone who understood both cruelty and elegance. His eyes were closed, but she could see the faint movement beneath his lids, the flutter of consciousness fighting against whatever force those chains were pressing into him. She had 3 minutes before the guards rotated back to this corridor. She had stumbled onto this place by accident, or what she had thought was accident, 3 weeks ago, when she had run from her stepfather's house in the middle of the night with $40 and a bruised cheek and absolutely no plan, and had ended up sheltering in the old Valemont building on the edge of the city because it was the only structure large enough and abandoned, looking enough that no one would think to look for a runaway inside it. She had learned, slowly and then all at once, that it was not abandoned, that the Valemont name was not a historical curiosity, that the things moving through the corridors after midnight were not human. She had also learned, by listening through walls and reading the documents she was never supposed to find, that the man chained in this room was Nikolai Valemont, heir to one of the oldest vampire dynasties in the world, and that his own court had put him there. 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Cassandra crossed the room. She had the iron key she had stolen from the steward's coat 3 nights ago, and she had spent every hour since then trying to understand what she was walking into, what the blood law meant when it was invoked against an heir, what the ancient vow that bound the Valemont line actually required of its members. She was not a fool. She understood, intellectually, that the creature kneeling in front of her could kill her in a matter of seconds, and that freeing him was not guaranteed to produce gratitude. She understood that she was a human in a vampire court, that she had no power here, that the only reason she had survived 3 weeks inside these walls was because she had been careful and quiet and had not yet been noticed. She understood all of that. She reached for the first chain anyway. The moment her fingers touched the metal, it burned. Not hot but cold, a cold that stabbed up through her palm and into her forearm like ice water injected directly into her veins. She bit down on a cry and held on. The symbol beneath her fingers flared white and then went dark, and she heard the mechanism inside the lock click as the key found its home. The man's eyes opened. They were the color of deep water in winter. Not blue exactly, not silver exactly. Something that occupied the space between those two colors, the way storm clouds occupied the space between sky and earth. They found her immediately, with a precision that made her understand viscerally that whatever state he had been in a moment before, he was fully present now. "You are human," he said. His voice was low and measured and carried the kind of absolute authority that did not need to be raised to fill a room. It was the voice of someone who had never once in his existence needed to beg for attention. "Very observant," Cassandra said, and worked on the second chain. "I'm going to need you to stay quiet and follow me, and we can have the full conversation later." He watched her with those winter water eyes. "You understand what you are freeing. Nikolai Valemont, heir to the Valemont blood throne, imprisoned by his own court under invocation of the severance law." She met his gaze briefly. "Yes, I did my research." Something moved across his face that she could not entirely read. Surprise, perhaps, shaded with something more complex. "The severance law cannot be broken by a human touch," he said. "The chains are bound to vampire blood. A human key should not." The second chain fell away. They both stared at it. Cassandra filed that away for later, grabbed the key, and reached for the third. 1 minute and 10 seconds. She worked faster, and he let her, watching her with an expression that had shifted from cold assessment to something more carefully attentive. The way a man watches a fire he has not decided whether to extinguish or to feed. The last chain dropped to the stone floor with a sound like a bell struck underwater, resonant and final, and Nikolai Valemont rose from his knees. He was taller than she had estimated. He was broader. He was standing upright in the half-dark with his white hair loose and those chains falling from his body, the single most overwhelming physical presence she had ever been in proximity to, and for one unguarded moment Cassandra Briar felt genuine fear. He looked at her, he looked at the fallen chains, he looked at the door. "This way," Cassandra said, and turned toward the hidden passage. After a single beat of silence, she heard him follow. They were through the passage and 3 corridors deep before she heard the guards reach the chamber. She pressed herself against the wall of a narrow service tunnel, and Nikolai pressed in beside her, closer than she expected. His presence at her back a wall of cold that rapidly became something else entirely, a stillness so complete it was almost a sound of its own. The guards' voices passed, receded, disappeared. Cassandra let out a breath. "Where are we going?" Nikolai asked, still very quiet, his voice just beside her ear. "There's a basement exit that connects to the city drainage system. I mapped it in my first week here." She pushed off from the wall and moved. 3 blocks north comes up behind an old transit station. From there we can get distance. "You mapped the escape routes," he said, following her through the dark, as if darkness was simply a room he had always lived in. "I map things. It's what I do when I'm somewhere I don't belong." She navigated a turn, then another. "I figure out how to leave." He was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks. "No one found you. I was careful." Another silence, and then, almost to himself, 3 weeks. In the Valemont estate, human, undetected, for 3 weeks. She could hear in his voice that he was recalibrating something, adjusting some internal model of her, and she found she did not mind. They reached the basement exit. The metal door was corroded and heavy, and when Cassandra put her shoulder into it, it moved perhaps 2 inches before catching on a warped frame. She shoved again. It did not cooperate. Nikolai stepped past her, set one palm flat against the door, and pushed with the casual ease of someone moving paper across a desk. The door swung outward into cold night air and the distant, omnipresent sounds of the city. "Thank you," Cassandra said, and stepped through. The night received them. The city, indifferent and enormous, spread out in all directions. Headlights and glass, and the smell of rain on asphalt, and Cassandra walked into it with Nikolai Valemont 3 steps behind her. Feeling with every step they took away from that building that the world had just changed, in a way she was not yet equipped to fully understand. The transit station was as she remembered it, closed for renovation and half-draped in scaffolding, its lower level accessible through a side panel she had pried open during her 3rd day in the city. She brought them inside, into the dusty warmth of a structure that had been important once and was now simply waiting. And that was where Nikolai stopped moving and turned to face her in full for the first time. The station's emergency lighting was on, casting everything in amber. In it, the sheer presence of him was even more pronounced. The white hair, the precise architecture of his face, the quality of stillness he carried, that was nothing like rest and everything like the held tension of a predator at full alert. His clothing was fine even after captivity. A dark shirt and trousers that had once been expensive and still had not entirely forgotten it, and the marks the chains had left on his wrists were already fading, healing with the rapid efficiency of his nature. Cassandra sat on a dusty bench and looked at him. "Why?" he said. "Why what? Why did you free me? You are human. You had no stake in my imprisonment." The logical action was to remain hidden and uninvolved. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything seriously, because she had learned early that careful thinking was the only real protection available to someone without money or power or anyone in their corner. "I read the documents. I understood what the severance law meant and what your court was doing." She held his gaze. "They were going to bleed you out slowly across 100 years, keeping you alive just enough to use your bloodline as a legal instrument, while everything you were supposed to inherit went to your cousin Aldrich." She paused. "That is what they were doing, yes?" His jaw tightened. A small thing, barely visible, but it was the first crack she had seen in the absolute composure. "Yes, I don't like it when people imprison someone to use them as a tool," Cassandra said. "I have some personal experience with that dynamic." He was very still. "Your face." She touched her cheek reflexively, then dropped her hand. The bruise was 3 weeks old now, reduced to a shadow of yellow-green that she supposed was still visible. "My stepfather, that's why I ran." Something shifted in his eyes. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition, one darkness seeing another. "You ran from your own cage," he said, "and then you chose to open mine. When you say it like that, it sounds poetic. Mostly I was just angry on your behalf." She shrugged. "I also couldn't stop thinking about it once I understood. I'm not built to know something is wrong and just walk past it." Nikolai Valemont studied her for a long moment with those extraordinary eyes, and then he said, "Your name, Cassandra Briar. I owe you a debt, Cassandra Briar." The way he said her name, precise, deliberate, as though he were committing it to memory with the permanence that only immortality could afford, made something in her chest do something she chose not to examine immediately. "Among my kind, a debt of this nature is not a courtesy. It is binding. You freed the heir of Valemont from a lawful imprisonment at direct personal risk. By the old world code under which my family has operated for 6 centuries, your life is now under my protection until the debt is discharged or you release me from it." "I don't need protection," Cassandra said. "You are a human woman alone in a city where my court will shortly be searching for whoever broke the severance chains, and where your stepfather may also be searching for you." He sat down across from her, not perched awkwardly on the dusty bench, but seated with the complete ease of someone who has never once questioned whether a space was his to occupy. "You may be correct that you do not need protection, but you have it." She looked at him for a long time. "You're not going to negotiate this," she said. "I am not going to negotiate this," he confirmed. Cassandra had spent most of her 23 years being someone who handled things alone. Her mother had been ill for years before she died, which meant Cassandra had been the adult in that household since she was 15, managing medications and appointments, and the careful performance of normalcy at school so that no one would have cause to intervene in ways that would be worse than the problem they were solving. She had become, by necessity, someone who did not lean on others, someone who found the leaning itself more frightening than the weight she was carrying, the idea of being protected by a 600-year-old vampire heir who looked at her with those winter water eyes as though she were a problem he found genuinely interesting, was so outside her established framework that for a moment she simply could not process it. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not going to stop making decisions. I would not expect you to, and when I figure out where I'm going and what I'm doing next, I'm not going to ask permission." "You freed me from chains," Nikolai said. With the faintest inclination of his head that she was beginning to understand was his version of a gesture of respect. "I am not in the business of putting people back in them," she believed him. That surprised her. She did not generally trust quickly, but there was something in the absolute directness of him, the complete absence of performance in his words, that made the usual warning systems in her go quiet. He was dangerous. She was not foolish enough to forget that, but he was honest in a way that very few safe people she had ever known had been. They needed to move. Cassandra knew that the court would be searching, and that searching for a freed heir would not be gentle or subtle. She ran through what she knew. Nikolai's court was controlled, currently, by his uncle Varek Valemont and his cousin Aldrich, who had invoked the severance law on a technicality 3 months ago. She had found the dated documents, and who had been methodically consolidating control of the dynasty's considerable legal and financial holdings in the human world. Vampire courts did not operate purely in shadow. The oldest dynasties had long since established presences in human legal and financial infrastructure under human-looking names, and Valemont was one of the most deeply embedded, which meant that whoever was helping Varek in the human world would also be looking for Nikolai. She explained this to him quickly, pacing the station while he sat and listened, with the complete attention of someone who had been trained, across centuries, to absorb strategic information rapidly. "Varek has a contact," Nikolai said when she finished. "Human, a man named Corvin Ashby. He operates as a legal representative for Valemont Holdings, and he has been instrumental in the documentation supporting the severance claim. His voice had gone very level and very quiet on those last words, which Cassandra was learning to understand as the register in which he was most genuinely angry. If Varek contacts Ajdi tonight, the human authorities will be involved by mourning through channels I cannot immediately counter.
Can you counter them eventually? If I reach the secondary archive.
He looked at her. There is a location in the city, a place not known to Varek, not recorded in any document he could have accessed. A secondary court archive maintained by my mother's line, not my father's. It contains the original blood documentation of my designation as heir, signed and bound before I was a century old, which predates and supersedes any severance invocation. He paused. If we reach it, I have the legal standing to dissolve the severance and call a formal challenge to Varek's regency. Where is it? The Carmine building. Sub-level 3, behind the maintenance infrastructure. It was constructed when that building's ground floor was still a textile warehouse. 1891. Cassandra thought. The Carmine building is on the east side. If Varek has people searching from the estate, that's toward them, not away. Yes. So we'd be moving through the search rather than away from it. Yes, that's a terrible plan. It is the only plan that ends with something other than perpetual flight, Nikolai said. Running indefinitely is not a resolution. It is a postponement. She hated that he was right. They moved through the city at 1 in the morning, when the streets were not empty, but were populated by the particular variety of people who moved through cities at 1 in the morning and had every reason to keep their eyes forward and their business their own. Cassandra had spent enough time in enough cities at bad hours to know how to move through them. Shoulders straight, pace deliberate. The walk of someone who has a destination and means to reach it, and is not interested in any side conversations on the way. Nikolai moved beside her like a sentence that cannot be misread. He wore the night the way aristocrats wear formal clothes, as though it were made for him specifically, as though the darkness had arranged itself as a courtesy. She was aware of him with every step, aware of the leashed quality of his movement, the way the space around him seemed to hold its breath. You're going to attract attention, she said quietly. You're too. She searched for the word. You're too there. He glanced at her. I am aware of how to move through human spaces without drawing notice. You don't look like you are. I look like someone who belongs everywhere, he said. Among humans, that is generally sufficient. She considered this and found, irritatingly, that it was probably true. There was a particular kind of person who moved through the world with such complete conviction of their own legitimacy that their visibility functioned as a form of invisibility. They were too assuredly present to be suspicious. She had seen it in wealthy humans her whole life. In Nikolai, it was simply the purest possible version of that quality uncut by performance. What happened? She asked. Because they had a 20-minute walk and she needed to understand the full picture. With the severance law, how did Varek actually invoke it? Nikolai was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she felt the weight of something old and painful, the specific texture of a betrayal that had been total. There is a provision in the Valemont blood law, he said, that allows the severance of an heir's claim if 2 conditions are met. First, the heir must be shown to have violated the ancient vow, the binding oath taken at designation which prohibits an heir from forming certain prohibited alliances that could compromise the dynasty's independence. He paused. Second, the violation must be witnessed and documented by 3 members of the court in full standing. What alliance did they claim you formed? They claimed I had entered into a binding compact with the Dravenhouse line. Cassandra had done enough reading to know that name. The Dravenhouse, the rival dynasty. Our families have been in formal opposition since 1542. An heir of Valemont forming any compact with Dravenhouse would be a genuine violation of the ancient vow. Yes. His voice was entirely flat now. I formed no such compact. What I did was meet twice with Serafel Dravenhouse, the heir of that line, to discuss the possibility of a formal peace negotiation, an end to a 480-year blood feud that has cost both dynasties tremendously. He looked straight ahead as they walked. Varek took those meetings and reframed them with manufactured documentation as a secret alliance pact. 3 court members, all of whom he had spent the previous year quietly compromising, witnessed the manufactured documents. A trap, Cassandra said, an exquisitely designed one. He used my own desire for peace as the mechanism. She thought about that for a moment, the particular cruelty of it, the way it had taken something genuinely honorable and turned it into the instrument of his destruction. The Draven House heir, she said. Seraphel, do they know what happened to you? I do not know what Seraphel has been told. His tone was careful here, more carefully controlled than it had been on anything else, and Cassandra filed that away. The Draven House line has their own complex politics, but they might be an ally. They might. Or they might have been told I was the one who manufactured the documentation to destroy the peace process. He shook his head slightly. I cannot know until I have legal standing to make contact, which requires the archive. The Carmine building came into view at the end of the block, 12 stories of 1920s architecture, steel and stone, which had been occupied by various businesses over the decades and was currently home to an insurance brokerage, a law firm and, on its highest floors, something registered as a private investment company that Cassandra now understood was a human-facing shell for Valemont financial operations. The lobby was dark. The building's security was standard commercial, camera systems, and a card reader at the main entrance. And Cassandra had walked past this building twice in her 3 weeks of city exploration without knowing what it was. She thought about that for a moment, about how much of the city was like this, ordinary surfaces over extraordinary depths. The maintenance entrance, she said. East side of the building, loading bay. From there we can reach the service elevator, which should access the sublevels without requiring the same credentials as the main lift. Nikolai looked at her with that expression again, the one she was starting to recognize. The one that said he was recalibrating his model of her, upward. You have been planning for contingencies in a building you did not know was relevant, he said. I plan for contingencies in every building I walk past. It's a habit. She moved toward the east side of the block. I grew up understanding that exits matter. They reached the loading bay. The door was the old-fashioned kind, with a mechanical lock rather than a card reader. Older infrastructure. The building's bones older than its renovations, and Cassandra's picks, which she had carried in a small case in her jacket pocket for 2 years, made short work of it. Nikolai watched her pick the lock with an expression of what she was fairly certain was genuine appreciation. Where did you learn that? He asked. A woman I knew when I was 17. She had a complicated life. Cassandra eased the door open and slipped through. She said every woman should know 3 things: how to pick a lock, how to drive anything, and how to walk away. Sound philosophy, Nikolai said, following her in. The sublevels were below the lowest basement, accessible through a service shaft that Nikolai had to fold himself to fit through with any degree of grace, which was the first time Cassandra saw him look remotely inconvenienced by anything. She bit down a smile and descended the metal ladder ahead of him. Sublevel 3 was not a basement. It was a chamber that had been built with deliberate intentionality. The ceiling was arched. The walls were smooth stone fitted together with the kind of precision that came from artisans who took genuine pride in their work, and the air was cool and dry with the particular stillness of a space that had been sealed against the outside world for decades. Along the walls were iron-banded cases, large and sealed, and at the center was a table of dark wood, so old it had developed the color of deep water. Nikolai crossed the cases with the purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where he was going after a long time of being prevented from going anywhere. Cassandra watched him work the mechanisms. No key required here. The cases opened to his presence. She understood, some kind of blood-resonant lock that recognized the specific signature of the Valemont heir. And when the central case opened, she saw the interior was lined with aged silk and contained within it a collection of documents in a hand she did not recognize. He lifted the one he needed with a care that was the most human thing she had seen him do yet, a reverence that belonged entirely to someone who had learned what things could be taken from you. This is it, he said quietly. The primary designation document. My mother's blood seal is here. Varek's forgeries cannot supersede this. What do you do with it now? He was already thinking. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, the way the problem was being assembled behind those winter water eyes. There is a court mechanism, the assembly of claimants, which can be convened on an emergency basis if an heir presents primary documentation of designation and requests a formal review of a severance invocation. He looked at her. I need to convene it before Varric knows I have this document. Once he knows, he will take steps to prevent the assembly from occurring. How long do you have until dawn? The assembly must be convened in the dark hours. It is one of the oldest rules in the blood law. Court proceedings of this severity cannot occur under sunlight, because sunlight limits the powers of the eldest members of the court, and the blood law requires full capacity from all parties. Dawn was approximately 4 hours away. Tell me what you need, Cassandra said. She saw something move across his face when she said that, quick, genuine, poorly concealed. She thought it might have been the word we. The implication that she was not going to step back, that she was in this alongside him. The assembly requires a convening location that is neutral ground, he said. The estate is compromised, but there is a second location, a property held jointly by 5 of the oldest dynasties as neutral court territory, a place called the Vantrice Hall. It operates as a private event venue in the human world. It is neutral ground by treaty, and Varric cannot prevent the assembly from occurring there. Where is it? South of the city centre, a building called the Ashford. He paused. Which creates the problem that we must reach it without being intercepted, and Varric will have people moving within the hour. They had been in the archive for 12 minutes. Cassandra thought rapidly. How many people does Varric have in the city? At minimum, 4. At maximum, 10. These are not soldiers, they are court members, most of them old enough to be genuinely dangerous, but they are operating under political constraint. They cannot move openly in the human world without creating exposure, so they have the same limitations we do. They have to be subtle. Yes, then we move the same way we did before, in the open. The last thing they'll expect is for you to be walking openly through the city 3 hours before you have to be somewhere. She folded her arms. Do you have any way to reach the neutral court and request the emergency assembly from outside? He thought. There is a communication channel. The dynasties maintain a shared notification system, ancient in origin, but adapted to modern infrastructure. If I send a formal request through that channel before Varric can intercept it, the assembly has to be convened by the Old World Code. No dynasty can refuse a formal emergency request from a designate heir with primary documentation. He reached into the case again and extracted a small device. It looked like a very old, very elegant pocket watch, but it was not. This sends through the blood channel, then send it now, then we move. He did. Cassandra did not watch the mechanism exactly, because she had the sense that the blood channel was not something meant for human eyes. But she watched his face while he used it, watched the focus and then the brief flash of relief when the signal was sent. And she thought, no matter how old he is, no matter how controlled, there is a person inside all of that capability who has been genuinely terrified for whatever passes for him as months of captivity. She thought about 3 months of chains. She thought about what that would do to a person who was used to being one of the most powerful presences in any room. It is done, he said. Then let's go. They moved back through the service shaft, back into the loading bay, back into the city night that was now 3:45 in the morning and growing quieter as it moved toward the strange emptiness that preceded dawn. They had gone 4 blocks when Cassandra felt it. Not heard, not saw, but felt. The particular shift in the air that she had learned over 3 weeks of living in proximity to vampires. A change in atmospheric pressure that meant something was moving faster than anything human near them. Nikolai, she said. I know, he said, and his hand was at her elbow, not gripping, just present. They came from 2 directions, 2 members of Varric's court, recognizable by the same white-skinned, silver-eyed quality that marked old-blood vampires, wearing ordinary city clothes that fit them with the same wrongness as a disguise. The one on the left was a woman with cropped pale hair and a face like carved marble. The one on the right was tall and broad and had the particular expression of someone who had spent a very long time being physically intimidating. Nikolai, the woman said. Her voice was careful. Varric requests your voluntary return. The severance remains in force. You have no legal standing outside the estate. Send Varric my regards, Nikolai said, with a cordiality so complete it functioned as its opposite. I have just sent an emergency convening request through the blood channel to the neutral court. The Assembly of Claimants will be meeting at Vantrice Hall at 4:30. You are welcome to attend. The woman's expression shifted slightly. You cannot have the documentation, Mira. His voice was not raised, but it landed on her like a weight. I have known you for 60 years. You know what Varek has done. You know what the severance documents were built on. He held her gaze. You do not have to stand on the wrong side of this. Something moved across the court member's face, not doubt exactly, but the shadow of it, the broad man, moved toward Cassandra. Nikolai was between them before Cassandra fully registered the movement, not stepped between them, moved between them, with the kind of speed that did not look like speed because it was too complete to trace. He was simply, instantaneously, in the space between Cassandra and the threat, and his hand was at the broad man's collar, and his voice, when he spoke, had taken on a quality that had not been present before, something old and multi-layered and genuinely, profoundly dangerous. She is under my protection, Nikolai said, by the ancient debt law. Lay a hand on her, and you lay a hand on the Valemont heir's sworn protection, and there is no court in the world, human or blood, that will not hold you accountable for that. The broad man went very still. Doroth, the woman said quietly. Step back. Doroth stepped back. Nikolai's hand released him. He did not move away from Cassandra's side. The assembly will occur, he said to Mira. Come or do not. But do not attempt to prevent us from reaching Vantrice Hall, or the blood channel notification will include a formal record of your interference, and that will have consequences for your court, standing regardless of how the assembly resolves. Mira looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Cassandra, and the look she gave Cassandra was complex, something accessible in it, something that might have been grudging respect. We will not impede, Mira said. They walked away. Cassandra let out a slow breath. Nikolai remained beside her, still close, the residual alertness of him gradually settling as they moved again. You could have gone faster, she said after a moment. If I weren't here, you could have simply moved. Yes, he said. I slow you down. You freed me from the severance chains when a vampire could not. He looked at her as they walked. Your presence is not a complication, Cassandra. Do not calculate yourself as one. She was quiet for a moment. You said the chains shouldn't have responded to a human key. They should not have. Do you have a theory about why they did? He was quiet for longer than she expected. There are old accounts, he said finally, of the severance chains responding to a specific type of human. Not common humans, not rare in the sense of something supernatural, but rare in the sense of quality. Someone whose clarity of intention and strength of will creates a resonance that the blood law's own mechanisms recognize as legitimate. He glanced at her. The blood law is at its foundation not simply about blood. It is about rightness, about things being as they should be. A severance invoked on false grounds is, at some fundamental level, already illegitimate and a person with sufficient, he paused, choosing the word, integrity, might find that the locks respond to them in a way the law's architect never anticipated, because they never anticipated someone of that quality caring enough to try. Cassandra thought about this for a while. You're saying the chains thought I was right, she said. I am saying the chains recognized that I was wrongly bound. He looked at her, and that you were the one doing the recognizing. They reached Vantrice Hall at 4:15. The building that housed it in the human world was a renovated event space, tall windows and Georgian stonework, cleaned and maintained by staff, who understood nothing about what happened in its deepest rooms. The entrance to the neutral court level was around the building's eastern wing. Through a door that opened the moment, Nikolai set his hand against it. Blood recognition again, and descended through a staircase that emerged into something that bore no relationship to the event venue above. Vantrice Hall proper was enormous. It was clearly very old, older than any building should reasonably be this far underground in a modern city, the ceiling vaulted in stone, the floor a deep-grained marble that had been walked smooth by centuries of feet. The lighting provided by fixtures that Cassandra thought at first were electrical and then understood were something else entirely, a luminescence that came from within the stone itself, cool and blue-white and constant. There were already people there, not people, Cassandra corrected herself mentally. They were dynasty representatives, 6 of them, from the neutral court staff, all with the white-skinned, old blood quality of the eldest vampires. Their clothing, a mixture of modern and something older, formal, in a way that did not map precisely onto any human definition of formality. They looked at Nikolai when he entered with the focused assessment of people who had received the convening signal and were trying very rapidly to understand what they were walking into. They looked at Cassandra with expressions she chose not to try to interpret immediately. "Nikolai Valemont," said the eldest of the neutral court staff. A woman with hair so white it was nearly luminescent, her face ageless in the specific way of the very old vampires Cassandra had learned to recognize, which was not smooth but rather precisely what it was, unmarked by the particular wear of human aging, but carrying its own weight. "You have invoked the emergency assembly of claimants under Article 7 of the Blood Law. Produce your documentation." Nikolai produced it. He laid the designation document on the central table and stood back, and the assembled court staff leaned forward to examine it with the focused intensity of people who understood exactly what they were looking at, which Cassandra appreciated, because the last thing she needed right now was something moving slowly. The door opened again behind them. Varek Valemont came through it like a cold front. He was older looking than Nikolai in some indefinable way. Not in the physical sense, because he had the same white skin and pale hair, but in the way of someone who had spent a very long time moving toward specific things and was not accustomed to being moved against. He was well dressed and entirely composed and looked at Nikolai with an expression that Cassandra translated, without difficulty, as controlled fury. Behind him came Aldrich, younger in presentation, sharper in his agitation, with the look of someone who understood that things were not going the way they were supposed to, and two other court members she did not recognize. "The assembly cannot be legitimately convened," Varek said, addressing the neutral court rather than Nikolai. "The severance is in force. A bound heir has no legal standing to invoke Article 7. A bound heir," Nikolai said, and his voice had taken on the same layered quality it had used on Doroth. "The old blood resonance that moved through a room like a tide does not convene this assembly. A designated heir who has produced primary documentation demonstrating the illegitimacy of the severance invocation does." He looked at his uncle. "The documentation is on the table, Varek. 3 independent members of this neutral court are currently examining it. If you have counter-documentation that demonstrates the validity of your severance invocation, present it now." Varek's composure held, but Cassandra watched his eyes move to the table, to the document, to the seal, and she saw the precise moment he understood that the document was real and that his counter-documentation was manufactured, and that the neutral court members examining both would know the difference within minutes. "This is a manufactured crisis," Varek said, still addressing the court. "My nephew has been freed from lawful imprisonment by an outside party, a human woman who had no right or standing to interfere in blood law proceedings. The debt law," Cassandra said. The room went very quiet. She had not meant to speak. Or rather, she had meant to stay quiet and let Nikolai handle the politics, which were genuinely his domain. But the specific framing of that sentence, outside party who had no right, had landed in a way she could not leave unchallenged, because she had spent her entire life being told she had no right, no standing, no legitimate place in rooms where things were being decided, and she was done with it. "I beg your pardon," Varek said, looking at her directly for the first time, with the expression of someone who has just noticed that a piece of furniture is talking. "The debt law," Cassandra said, and she was surprised by how level her own voice was. "Under the Old World Code, a party who frees a wrongfully bound designate heir from an illegal severance gains formal stand through the debt relationship created at the moment of freeing. I am not an outside party with no standing. I am the holder of a debt relationship with Nikolai Valemont under the same code you're invoking to challenge my presence here." She held Varek's gaze. "If the Old World Code applies in this room, then it applies to me as well as to you." The eldest neutral court member looked at Cassandra for a long moment. "The human woman is correct," she said. "The debt law has no species provision. It applies universally to any party who meets the initiating conditions." A pause that felt like a held breath. "The severance documentation is also on preliminary examination inconsistent with the primary designation document in 3 critical binding elements. We will need 1 hour for full assessment. You don't have 1 hour, Aldrich said, and his voice had lost most of its composure. Dawn is in under an hour. You cannot complete a full assessment before sunlight restriction. The blood channel notification was sent at 3:47. The eldest court member said. Convening occurred at 4:15. The assembly was formally seated before the 1 hour restriction window. We will complete our assessment. She looked at Aldrich with an expression that was not unkind and not warm, and was entirely without negotiation. Sit down, Aldrich Valemont. Varek did not sit. He stood with his hands very still at his sides and looked at his nephew. And Cassandra saw, beneath the controlled fury, something that surprised her. He looked old. Not in the physical sense, but in the sense of someone who's been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has built his entire identity around the carrying of it, and can now see the moment approaching where the thing will be set down by someone else's hand, and does not know who he is without it. She felt something she had not expected to feel for Varek Valemont. Not sympathy, exactly, not mercy, but understanding. She did not let it slow her down. The assessment took 47 minutes. Cassandra spent most of it seated on a stone bench along the hall's wall, watching the neutral court members work with the document, watching Nikolai stand in the center of the room with the stillness of someone who has learned through very long experience that there are situations where all you can do is hold your ground and wait, and watching Varek, who stood near the door and said nothing further, and looked at his nephew with an expression that was shifting, gradually from controlled fury to something else. At one point, Nikolai came and sat beside her. He did not do it with any particular announcement. He simply came to where she was and sat down, and there was a quality to the way he did it that was different from any of the ways he had been around her before. Less the formal protector, less the strategic partner, more simply a person sitting beside a person, closer than strictly necessary, the cold of him gradually warming through the simple fact of proximity. You don't have to stay here, he said quietly. When this is resolved, when I have standing again, your debt is discharged. You are free to go wherever you choose. I know that, she said. I want to be certain you know it. You freed me. You have not volunteered to be part of whatever comes after. She looked at him. In the blue-white luminescence of the hall, his face was extraordinary. The perfect lines of it, the winter water eyes, the white hair loose around his shoulders. She thought about the man who had been kneeling on stone in chains. She thought about what he had said. You ran from your own cage and then you chose to open mine. Nikolai, she said, and she realized it was the first time she had used his name directly. She saw him register it, saw something in those eyes change like weather changing. What happens to you after this? Assume it goes the way it should. You have your standing back. The severance is dissolved, Varek's regency is challenged and overturned. Then what? Then I rebuild. His voice was quiet. There is a great deal of work that has been undone or corrupted in 3 months. The peace process with Dravenhouse, the court's relationship with the neutral dynasties, the financial holdings that Aldrich has been redirecting. A pause. It will take time, significant time. And the people in your court who supported Varek? The ones who manufactured the witness testimony? His jaw tightened in that small way again. That is a more delicate matter. Some of them were compromised by Varek, coerced rather than genuinely aligned. Others were genuinely aligned. He shook his head slightly. 6 centuries of dynasty means that the internal politics rarely simple. But you'll handle it, I will handle it, he agreed. There was no arrogance in it. Just certainty, the kind that comes from knowing your own capabilities completely. The peace process with Dravenhouse, she said. You were genuinely trying for that. Peace between our lines would end something that has cost 480 years of damage on both sides and serves no one's interests currently, including our enemies. He looked at her. I have always believed it was possible. Serafel Dravenhouse believed it too, or was beginning to. Varek understood that the peace process would have consolidated my position and made the severance politically impossible to achieve, which is why he moved when he did. So one of the things you do when you get your standing back is restart that process. Yes, that's good, Cassandra said. That's the kind of thing that matters. He looked at her for a long moment. The hall was very quiet around them. The neutral court members were still working, and Varek was still standing near the door, and the world outside was moving toward dawn. But in this particular moment, sitting on a stone bench in an underground hall that was older than most of the city above it, Cassandra felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt still, not the stillness of someone holding themselves together, not the careful, controlled stillness of someone managing a difficult situation. Just still, beside her, Nikolai was watching her with an expression that had given up trying to be something other than what it was, and what it was tender. "Your life," he said. "After tonight, where does it go? I haven't figured that out yet. You had $40 and a bruised cheek when you ran. I also have a degree in archival studies that I never finished because my mother got sick, and then I had to deal with my stepfather, and then I ran. And I have 3 weeks of experience navigating a vampire court undetected." She let herself almost smile. "I'm probably overqualified for most entry-level positions." "Archival studies," he said, and there was something very careful in how he said it. "Yes, I have an archive," he said. "Several of them. They are extensive, historically significant, and in considerable disassorted because the archivist who managed them for the last 30 years retired in the 1770s and was never replaced." She stared at him. "That is either the most transparently self-interested job offer in history," she said, "or the most charming." "It is both," he said, "and I am not known for making offers I intend to rescind. You could leave at any time. The work would be genuine, the conditions would be comfortable, and—" He paused, and she had the sense that what followed was costing him something, some piece of composure he was deliberating over whether to spend. "I would prefer," he said, "not to watch you walk away." The hall was very quiet. "Is that the debt talking?" she asked. "The debt has nothing to do with it." He held her gaze with the steady, complete directness that she had come to understand was the truest version of him. "The debt is a legal mechanism. What I am telling you is a personal one," Nikolai, the eldest neutral court member, said from the central table, and they both turned. "The assessment is complete." Nikolai rose. Cassandra rose beside him. The eldest member looked at the assembled hall, the neutral court, Nikolai, Varek, Aldrich, the court members on both sides. "The primary designation document is legitimate, predating and superseding the severance invocation in all binding elements," she said. "The severance documentation contains 3 critical inconsistencies with authenticated blood seal methodology that constitute prima facie evidence of manipulation." A pause in which the room did not breathe. "Under Article 7 of the Blood Law, this assembly therefore recognizes Nikolai Valemont as the designated heir of the Valemont line in full standing, dissolves the severance invocation effective immediately, and opens a formal inquiry into the legitimacy of the invocation process." She looked at Varek. "Varek Valemont, the inquiry will require your testimony. You are not at liberty to withdraw from neutral court jurisdiction pending its completion." Varek stood very still. Then, slowly, he turned to look at Nikolai. The controlled fury was gone. The old heavy look was what remained, and beneath it, stripped of everything else, something that might have been grief. "You would have had it eventually," Varek said. His voice was quiet. "Your father was going to give you everything. You were always the chosen one. I spent 2 centuries in this dynasty building something, and your father erased it in a sentence when he named you heir." He shook his head. "I am not asking for your understanding. I know what I did. I am simply telling you why." "I know why," Nikolai said. He looked at his uncle with an expression that was not forgiving and was not cruel. "I have always known why. That is what made it hurt most." Varek said nothing else. The formal proceedings that followed took another hour. Documentation, testimony, the technical requirements of the formal inquiry. And by the time they emerged from Vantrice Hall, the sky to the east was the color of a bruise turning toward gold, the first real light of morning beginning to press against the horizon. Nikolai stopped on the steps and looked at it. Vampires of the old blood could tolerate indirect sunlight. She knew now. It weakened the eldest and the most powerful, but did not destroy. It was direct, unfiltered sunlight that created genuine danger, and even then the effect was graduated by age and power. Nikolai, standing in the pre-dawn dimness, was entirely safe for now. But she had noticed, in the week before she freed him, that he had not been in sunlight. that the estate's windows were all heavily draped, that the rhythm of the court was entirely nocturnal. She had begun to understand that the choice to live in darkness was not purely about survival for vampires of his generation. It was cultural. It was the shape of their world. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The sun. Did you ever see it? Before you became." She stopped because she realized she did not know his full history, did not know at what age he had been turned, or whether he had been born into this. "I was born into it," he said, answering the unspoken question. "There are very old families who have been vampire for generations that the blood becomes innate, not transformed. My line is one of them. I have never been human." He looked at the bruising sky. "I do not miss what I have never had, but I find it," he paused, "beautiful from this distance." "Is that what I am?" Cassandra said. "Beautiful from a distance." She had not entirely meant to say that. It came out more pointed than she intended. Sharper with something she had not fully acknowledged being there, and she watched his face turn toward her. "No," he said. "You are beautiful from no distance at all." The morning light was growing. Behind them, the last of the court members were filing out of the hall, and the city was waking up around them, traffic sounds, and the distant alarm of a delivery truck, and all the ordinary noise of a world that had no idea what had just happened beneath it. "Come," Nikolai said. "We need to be out of the direct path before the sun clears the buildings." He began to move, and she moved with him, and at some point in the movement, she was not sure which of them initiated it. His hand was at her back, not gripping, just present, warm and steady, and she let it stay. They went back to the estate. It felt different than it had 8 hours before, the same building, the same corridors. But the weight of the thing that had been wrong inside it was gone, dissolved with the severance, and the staff who encountered them in the halls showed a range of responses from visible relief to careful neutrality, and Nikolai moved through all of it with the authority of someone who has returned to himself. He gave her a room. It was not a small room. It had windows that looked over the estate's walled garden, heavy curtains that she pulled back to let in the morning light, and a bed that was considerably more comfortable than anything she had slept in since she left home. She slept for 6 hours. When she woke, it was afternoon, and the estate was different again. People moving with purpose, voices in the corridors she could not hear clearly, but could feel the purposefulness of. The sense of a court reorienting itself around a gravitational center that had been restored to its proper position. She found Nikolai in the library on the 2nd floor, which was a room that made her want to sit down and never leave. Floor-to-ceiling shelves and a fireplace, and the quality of light that comes through windows, when the afternoon sun is at exactly the right angle to turn everything amber. He was at the desk, working through documents with a systematic focus that had clearly been going for several hours already. He looked up when she came in. "You should have slept longer," he said. "I don't sleep long when I'm in unfamiliar places." She came to the desk and looked at what he was working on. "Court documents, financial records, communications. What's the damage?" "Considerable but survivable." He sat back in his chair. Aldrich redirected approximately a third of the dynasty's financial holdings over the 3 months of the severance, but most of the transactions were structured in ways that leave legal recourse. The neutral court inquiry will provide additional leverage. He paused. "The court members who manufactured testimony are currently in discussions with my legal representatives about the terms of their cooperation with the inquiry." "And Varek?" "Varek is being held in neutral court custody pending the formal inquiry. The outcome of that will depend on the findings, but," he stopped, something shifting behind his eyes. "He will not be given back what he took. But he is my father's brother, and I do not want to destroy him. That's a difficult thing to carry. Most things worth carrying are." He looked at her. She was wearing borrowed clothes from the estate's considerable wardrobe, which fit well enough and were far better than what she had arrived in. And she had her hair loose from the braid she usually kept it in. And she was standing in his library in the afternoon light, and he was looking at her the way the pre-dawn light had been looking at the horizon. "Serafel Dravenhouse," Cassandra said, because she had been thinking about it since the early morning. "You need to contact them before Varek's people do. If there's any chance that Serafel was given a version of events that implicates you in the peace process failing, you need to get ahead of that." I know. Do you want my help drafting the communication? He was quiet for a moment. You have a degree in archival studies. I also have very good instincts about how to frame something that needs to land correctly the first time, she said. I spent a lot of years managing situations that required saying exactly the right thing to exactly the right person. Different context, but the skill translates. He looked at her. Sit down then. She sat. He moved his chair slightly, and she pulled another close to the desk, and they worked side by side for 2 hours. Drafting the communication to the Dravenhouse Heir, careful and precise and honest, acknowledging what had happened without over-explaining, leaving space for the other party to respond without feeling cornered, including specific documentation references that would establish the timeline of Varek's manipulation without requiring Serafel to take anything on faith. Cassandra had always been good at language. She understood the mechanics of how sentences landed, how the arrangement of information shaped the emotional response of the person receiving it, how honesty could be structured to be received as honesty rather than strategy. Working through the draft with Nikolai was something she found genuinely pleasurable, not just useful. He thought in precise, architecturally complete sentences, and she thought it in emotional logic, and the two things together produced something better than either alone. They sent it through the blood channel's diplomatic subdivision as the sun dropped below the buildings and the estate moved into evening. The response came in less than an hour. Serafel Dravenhouse had been told, by a court member loyal to Varek, that Nikolai had abandoned the peace process and initiated the manufactured evidence himself. The response to Nikolai's communication was long, detailed, and included 3 attachments. The documents Serafel had been given, the timeline of when they were presented, and a personal note that Cassandra read over Nikolai's shoulder and found, despite herself, moving, Serafel had not wanted to believe it. That was what came through between the careful, formal language. The Dravenhouse Heir had not wanted to believe that the person they had been meeting with, who had approached the peace process with what Serafel described as genuine conviction, had been deceiving them. They still want the peace process, Cassandra said. Yes. Nikolai's voice was quiet. There was relief in it, and something more than relief. Yes, they are willing to reconvene when the formal inquiry has been completed and the record is clear. That's good, Cassandra said, and she meant it with her whole self. That's genuinely good, Nikolai. 480 years. He turned to look at her, and this close. In the evening light of the library, with his white hair loose around his face, and his eyes, the color of everything deep and still, and cold and clear, she stopped thinking about things strategically. I would like, he said very carefully, to know if you plan to take the position. The archival position. Yes. She had been thinking about it all day, in the careful, methodical way she thought about decisions, turning it from every angle. Examining the motivations of the person offering it, examining her own motivations in considering it, making sure she understood what she would be stepping into. And she had concluded, with the part of her that was genuinely honest, that the archival work was real and interesting and would be meaningful. She had concluded that the estate was safer than anywhere she had been in years. She had concluded that the work she had already done in the last 24 hours had been the most genuinely purposeful she had felt since her mother was alive. And she had concluded that Nikolai Valemont, 6 centuries old and white-haired and terrifying and honorable and careful and entirely direct, was someone she wanted to know better with a completeness that bypassed all her usual defenses. I think, Cassandra said, that you should know that I'm not easy to live with. I'm not saying that to be charming. I'm saying it as actual information. I wake up at odd hours and rearrange things, and I ask too many questions and I do not respond well to being managed. I am aware, Nikolai said, of all of those things. I have spent the last several hours working alongside you. Then yes, she said, I'll take the position. The silence that followed was not a comfortable silence. It was a charged silence, full of the things that had not been said over 24 hours of running and chain-breaking and court politics and document drafting, the accumulation of all the moments where something had moved between them and been set aside in favor of the more pressing concern. Nikolai rose from his chair. She rose too, because she felt the shift in the moment, and her feet apparently understood before her head did that standing was the right posture for what was happening. He was closer than the formal distance his court manner maintained, closer than the strategic proximity of the night before, close in the way of a man who has decided to set something down. "I want to be very clear," he said, "about what I am about to say, because I do not want there to be any possibility of misreading it." "All right," she said. "I have lived a very long time," he said, "long enough to understand when something is rare. You are Cassandra Briar, the most genuinely extraordinary person I have met in a span of time most humans would find incomprehensible. You freed me from a wrongful imprisonment at direct personal risk with nothing to gain. You navigated the legal architecture of a vampire court with no preparation. You sat in the assembly of claimants and invoked the debt law to counter Varek's challenge, correctly and without hesitation, in a room full of 6th-century-old vampires." His voice had dropped to something that was very private, very direct, and you are kind, not the performed kindness of people who understand its social utility, genuine kindness, coming from someone who has been given very little reason to remain kind, and has remained it anyway. She was not going to cry. She had decided many years ago that she had better uses for emotional energy than crying, and that policy had served her well. She revised it slightly in this moment. "Nikolai," she said, "I am telling you that I would like you to remain, not as an archivist or not only as an archivist. I am telling you that I would like you to remain as the person who stood beside me in a night that was almost every kind of terrible and made every part of it better." He paused. "I am also telling you that I am aware of the difficulty of what I am suggesting. You are human, I am not. There are complexities in that which are not small. I would not ask you to set aside the weight of those complexities as if they do not exist. But," she said, "but I believe that the complexities that are real and serious are worth working through, and the ones that are not real are not worth using as reasons to step back from something true." His eyes held hers. "I have not felt something true in a very long time." She took a step forward, which closed the last of the distance. She kissed him. He was cold and still, and tasted of the particular darkness that was entirely his own, and his hands came up slowly, as though he was afraid of going too fast, one at her waist and one at her jaw. Gentle with an intentionality that felt like the most deliberate thing she had ever experienced. And she put her hands in the white hair she had been thinking about for 24 hours, and kissed him with all the complexity that the night had built in her. They stayed like that for a long time. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, which was such a human gesture coming from him, that she felt it in her chest like a struck note. "You are," he said very quietly, "going to cause me a tremendous amount of entirely welcome difficulty." "Yes," she agreed, "probably." The inquiry took 6 weeks, the formal process, conducted by the neutral court with full transparency, documented Varek's manipulation of the severance invocation in exhaustive detail. 3 court members who had provided manufactured testimony cooperated fully in exchange for reduced sanctions and were removed from court standing for a period of 30 years. 2 others who had been more deeply involved faced longer consequences. Aldrich, who had been a beneficiary more than an architect, was stripped of his succession claim and placed under a formal court bond that restricted his financial authority for a decade. Varek was found guilty of unlawful severance invocation, conspiracy against a designated heir, and violation of the dynasty's foundational blood law. His sentence, issued by the neutral court in consultation with Nikolai, was permanent removal from court standing and a 50-year exclusion from all dynasty affairs. He was not destroyed. Nikolai had been very clear about that. The court was given the chance to express itself on that decision, and a portion of it thought he was being too lenient. Nikolai reached those opinions with the complete equanimity of someone who did not actually require their approval for his choices, which Cassandra thought was one of the most attractive qualities he had. Corvin Ashby, the human legal representative who had assisted Varek, was handled through a combination of Nikolai's legal representatives and a carefully structured financial settlement that removed Ashby from his position in Valemont Holdings and closed the channels through which he had operated. Human legal systems were slower than blood law but not impenetrable. The The peace process with Dravenhouse was formally restarted in the second week of the inquiry's conclusion, with a preliminary meeting between Nikolai and Serafel Dravenhouse at Van Trice Hall. Cassandra was present in her capacity as the person who had helped draft the initial restoration communication, and she found Serafel to be precisely what the communication had suggested. Someone with genuine conviction about the peace process, someone who had been wounded by what they had been told, and was still willing to rebuild. The preliminary meeting produced a framework document and a tentative timeline for formal peace negotiations. 480 years of blood feud did not end in an afternoon, but it began. Cassandra's days became deeply, satisfyingly full. The archives were everything Nikolai had promised, and more, vast, historically layered, rich with material that had never been properly catalogued. Some of it in languages she needed to learn, and some of it in blood law script that required Nikolai to translate in sessions that became some of her favorite hours of the week. Sitting across from him at the library desk, while he decoded century-old documentation into the kind of precise, evocative language that made the history come alive for her, she built a cataloging system that the estate staff, vampire and human auxiliary alike, quickly adopted as genuinely useful, and she started a formal digitization project for the most fragile documents, which required her to learn a set of preservation techniques that she was deeply satisfied by. Her stepfather tried to contact her once, 6 weeks in, through a legal representative who had found her name through some chain of public record. Nikolai was in the room when she received the message, and he was very still in the specific way that meant he was actively controlling the response he was not going to express unless she asked him to. She did not ask him to. She handled it herself, clearly and completely, with a legal response that closed every avenue of further contact. When it was done, she looked up from the document she had just signed and found Nikolai watching her with that particular expression, the one that was not pride exactly but included pride. "You could have had me handle that," he said. "I know," she said. "It needed to come from me." "Yes," he said. "I know that too." His protectiveness was, she had found, something she had needed time to understand and even longer to accept. It was not the controlling kind she had known in her life before, not her stepfather's version, which was ownership wearing the costume of care. Nikolai's protectiveness was attentive and absolute, and entirely voluntary, a choice he made from a position of complete strength, which meant it never required her to be less than herself to function. He was protective because he cared, not because he needed her to need him. She had stopped keeping track of the exact shape of what she felt for him by week 4. By week 5, she had stopped pretending she was keeping track. By week 6, when the inquiry concluded and the last of the formal proceedings were closed, she told him she loved him in the library on a Tuesday afternoon with no particular ceremony, because the moment arrived and she was not the kind of person to let the right moment pass in favor of a better staged one. He set down what he was reading and looked at her for a moment, and then said, "I know," and then, "I love you." And she had expected the delivery to be more elaborate from someone who spent 6 centuries being regal about things, and found that she appreciated it more for not being so. The formal court, reconstituted after the inquiry, was a different thing from what it had been before. Some of the old members remained, some had faced sanctions, and some new appointments. Members Nikolai trusted for reasons he had thought through carefully and explained to Cassandra over several evenings reshaped the balance of it. The dynasty's work in both the vampire and human worlds moved forward, the financial holdings restored and reoriented, the legal infrastructure rebuilt. Cassandra, in her role as archivist, became something more over time. A person the court came to understand as integrated with Nikolai's orbit, not just professionally, and who carried in that integration a particular set of qualities that complemented his in ways the court members, old world and calculating as they were intelligent enough to respect. She understood human systems with the deep familiarity of lived experience. She understood the emotional logic of situations. She was, in the court's parlance, anchored, someone whose clarity of intention had apparently moved century-old chains, and whose presence in Nikolai's life moved him in ways that 6 centuries of politics had not. The debt law, technically, was discharged at the completion of the inquiry, when Nikolai's full standing was formally restored. He told her this formally, with the same directness he brought to everything. By the old world code, he said, the debt relationship between us is fully discharged. You are no longer bound to me by legal mechanism. Good, Cassandra said. Good, he agreed, and his hand found hers, and neither of them moved away. 6 months after the night, she had stumbled through the hidden door with a stolen key, and 4 minutes of clean air before the guards rotated. Cassandra Briar stood in the estate's walled garden on a late autumn evening and watched the last color drain from the sky. The garden was beautiful in the dark, the kind of beauty that didn't compete with daylight, that simply existed in its own register, the dark flowers and the old stone walls, and the smell of cold earth and the sounds of the city at a sufficient distance to be music rather than noise. Nikolai came through the garden door and found her there. He came to stand beside her, his shoulder against hers, looking at the same darkening sky. The Draven House preliminary framework was ratified today, he said. Both courts signed. The formal negotiations begin in the spring. 480 years, she said. And then some. He looked at her. It would not have happened without the work you did on the initial communication. Without being able to reframe the relationship from the starting point rather than from the damage. I just helped you say what you already meant. Yes, he said. But meaning something and being able to say it clearly are not always the same thing. You have been that for me, the clarity. She turned to face him. He was extraordinary, still, every time. The white skin, the pale hair, the precise beauty of his face in the darkness, the quality of him that occupied every room completely and had never once tried to occupy her. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. I didn't plan any of this, she said. I want to be clear about that. I ran from my stepfather's house with $40 and no plan, and ended up here by pure accident, and everything that followed was reaction and instinct and stubbornness. I didn't intend to free you. I didn't intend to stay. I didn't intend to fall in love with a 6-century-old vampire in the middle of a blood law crisis. She paused. I'm telling you this because I think it matters. Because the thing that's real is real precisely because it wasn't planned. I didn't decide to love you. I just did. Nikolai was quiet for a moment, and she saw in his face the thing she had first glimpsed through the cracks in the composure. Months ago in the station, the person inside the capability, the one who had been genuinely terrified, the one who looked at her like she was something rare. I have planned a great many things over a great many years, he said. Courts and alliances and negotiations and strategies. None of it prepared me for you. He raised a hand and touched her face, one thumb brushing her cheek where the bruise had been, where there was no longer any mark. I did not plan to look up from chains and find the person who would change everything. I did not plan to trust a human woman who moved through my court undetected for 3 weeks out of pure capability and inconvenient moral conviction. His voice was very quiet now. I also just did. She kissed him in the garden while the sky finished going dark and the city hummed its constant song around them, and she felt all the way through the deep and specific warmth of a person who has stopped running and has arrived. She was not naive. She knew the shape of what she had chosen, the complexity of a life built alongside an immortal. The questions about time that she and Nikolai had begun to discuss carefully and honestly, the way the world they both occupied would need to be continuously navigated with intelligence and care. She knew the court would always carry its politics, that the peace process would take years, that there would be new challenges and old-world problems and moments that would require everything she had. She also knew, with the precise and unambiguous clarity that had always been her best quality, that none of it frightened her. She had run from a cage in the middle of the night with nothing, and found, in the basement of a building she was never supposed to be in, a man, bound in chains that were not iron, who looked at her with winter-water eyes and said, "You understand what you are freeing." Yes, she had told him. She had not at the time fully understood how true that was. She did now. The garden was quiet around them. Nikolai's arms were around her, the cold of him, long since something she experienced as home, and above the estate the first stars of evening had appeared in the deep blue between the clouds. And the city moved and breathed around them with its enormous ordinary life. The Valemont heir had been bound in chains, and the human runaway had pulled him free, And what had grown from that single night of desperate action and inconvenient moral conviction was in the end the most important thing either of them had. Each other. The estate held them in its old stone arms, and the night held them in its darkness. And Cassandra Briar, who had spent a lifetime learning how to leave, had finally, fully learned how to stay.